Well, hello to everyone. I'm glad to have you here. This is Greg Gentry with Fireside Adoptees. Part of our Adoptee Fire series is reach out to adoptees in our community who have either significant perspectives or experiences to share that are deemed impactful for an audience that has specific questions around issues around adoption. And we're very pleased to have Dr. Amanda Baden tonight. She's a full professor and doctoral program director, the Graduate Counseling Program at Montclair State University in New Jersey, licensed psychologist practicing in New York. And her research and clinical focuses are on all the complex issues around transnational and international adoption, racial, cultural identity, and the adoption kinship network. We're just very happy to have you here, Amanda, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Greg. I'm glad to be able to be here.
Thanks. We'll start with the basics that people have for their stories. When and where were you adopted?
So first, I'm going to apologize if you hear horn honking or fire sirens, because I'm in my practice office.
Sure.
Right on 6th Avenue, and it's loud sometimes.
Understand.
So where and when? I was adopted in 1969 from Hong Kong, and I grew up in Pennsylvania, in central Pennsylvania.
Do you know any of the circumstances around your relinquishment?
I do, and I've also been in reunion with my birth mother for about 17 years.
Oh, wow.
So it's a little unusual, I think, for international adoptees to have that long, but I was kind of lucky and a bit persistent years ago in trying to find her, and I was lucky to do so. And so, you know, we don't speak the same language, so it's a complicated situation in that way, but I've been there to visit many times, and she's come here once, and so yeah, it's good. And I was adopted into a family where my dad was Jewish. He's passed away now, and my mom's Catholic, and I have an older sister who was also adopted from Hong Kong a few years before me. Oh. And as all adoptees have to say, no, she's not blood related. So
absolutely. So that actually answers a couple of the questions I was going to pose to you, which is one of them about other children in the family. So yes. Do you have earliest recollections about being adopted, and were they pretty open with you about it? Or I imagine it was apparent to you that you were different.
Yes, very early. I don't, you know, I was adopted when I was 13 months, so I don't have any recollections, but from the very beginning, one of our bedtime stories was our adoptions and stories about our birth families, that the things that my mom knew based on what the social worker had told her. So I feel like I've always known, and you know, and growing up at that time in the 70s, people didn't let you be racially different from your parents and not make comments. So
sure.
Yeah.
So it always felt like a sense of otherness then, right?
Yeah, I mean, I always felt like it was, you know, I think a lot of times adoptees get used to it in their home turf. They know some people know who they are, and they don't have to explain to everyone all the time. But as soon as you go on vacation or somewhere else, it all starts again. So
yeah.
Were
they pretty conversant about it with you? I mean, did they engage in conversation with you about it, or did you find that it didn't come up very often? I know you said that you weren't allowed not to be different in a way, but how was the conversation with them about it, your adoptive parents?
They were, you know, I mean, in a way, I think for the time they were fairly progressive. They kind of broke rules from the beginning by marrying each other. And then, but I think the way I describe it most commonly is that they were pretty aware of racial issues, because they also had dealt with a lot of blowback for them marrying religiously. So they were pretty aware of that. They were, my mom I watched her like confront people who said things, which I think was really important, because she didn't tell us to just ignore it and be okay with it. She would get really mad if someone said something. They just weren't good at recognizing their own white privilege. So I think that was the challenge. But in terms of racism directed towards us and our family. They were quite good at that. In terms of like adoption, I think it was seen as a very positive thing. It wasn't like a critical lens like we see now, but there was a lot less information that back then that
Yeah.
people had about what adoption really meant.
So of course, many adoptees relate to the concept of the fog. I've heard other people, other transracial adoptees say that it was a more difficult concept for them because they felt like they were so different their whole lives that they didn't feel like they were really in a fog. Do you find that to be a meaningful concept for you personally?
The fog, I do find it meaningful. I have a lot of thoughts about the fog too, because I think it depends on which parts of it you're talking about. Did I know all of the ugliest sides of adoption when I was younger? No, because it wasn't something advertised and there weren't many people writing about it at that time in terms of a critical lens. But the racial piece, I was aware of from very, very early on. And I'm actually kind of surprised by how many adoptees didn't have didn't feel like they had to develop that. I mean, I felt like I had to develop that to kind of navigate the world.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm curious, since you grew up with a sister who was also from Hong Kong, but from a different family, did she also search? Do you know if any of her experiences parallel at all to your own? No,
she did not search. She and I we're fairly close, but we're incredibly different as people, like as different as you could be in certain ways. So she's watched what I do, and she was there when she came with me when I met my birth mom for the first time, and my entire extended family on her side. And she decided she didn't want to search. So she'd been to Hong Kong a few times, but just wasn't something she wanted to do. So, yeah. I mean, we talk about it. She thinks that I would say that she says that I ask too many questions, and I say she doesn't ask enough. So that's kind of where we are.
I'm curious, when you found your mother and you experienced probably this great degree of disconnect from your whole past and heritage, what was that like for you to try? Did you feel like you should try to bridge this, or was it just an experience of, wow, this really isn't something I relate to, or did you feel a connection to it?
It made me feel much more connected to my Chinese heritage, 100%. I finally had some more ownership, I think, in being Chinese and feeling like there was a place for me there. There were people there for me, but
right.
I had already been working in post-adoption stuff for quite a while, so I'd heard a ton of different stories already. So my expectations, I really didn't have a whole bunch of expectations. I knew it could go a million different ways, and I was okay with how it would go. I didn't want to predict that it was going to be this best friends, buddies kind of situation. And I also hoped it was not going to be a one and done. But I got pretty lucky. And I have no explanation for why that is, except that I did get lucky.
That's a really fascinating perspective to have as someone professionally involved in that for so long before it even was something you experienced yourself.
Yeah.
I suppose there are a lot of people who, like me, who went at it without, it was totally seat of the pants and had no idea about expectation. And at least for me, I went into it with a lot of Hallmark movie thoughts in my head. And that happened for a while, and it didn't stay that way, but it certainly began that way and was that way for a bit. Fortunate to a degree for that. But you're the first person I've talked to who professionally knew what this was before you actually went through it yourself. That seems to be a unique thing, a unique perspective here. And
yeah. I'd already been doing research on adoption for about 10 years by that time, and been in practice for 5 or so years with almost exclusively adoptees. So it took me a while to find her. It took me about 4 years. So
oh, wow.
that was part of why I had a lot of time to kind of think about what was going to happen.
Yeah, and run it over and over. And it brings up the conversation I wanted to ask you about your career path, because you're immersed in adoption. And what made you go that direction?
So I wish I could tell you I had some grand plan and that it was all like really keenly figured out. It was not. Again, I feel there's been some, I've made some decisions that have gotten me in good positions to make others. So I didn't plan to be a psychologist or plan to study adoption because I didn't even think that was a thing. And this was we're talking like the 90s. There weren't any adult adoptees that I knew of who were doing anything like that. And I hardly knew any adult adoptees because we didn't have the internet. So I knew a few I knew the ones that I grew up knowing that my parents knew their parents, and then I met a few here and there, but not that many. So I went into psychology thinking I just wanted to work with people with mental health issues. And wasn't until I was entering my doc program, and when you do these interviews, they ask you what you want to study, what's your research interests. And I thought, well, I knew I was really interested in race and racial identity because as a person of color who didn't understand that part of themselves well,
Yes.
I wanted to understand that. But I also knew that none of those theories fit for us.
Mm.
So I said that in my interview, like, oh yeah, I want to figure this out because it doesn't really work. And I got lucky to get a Black woman psychologist to be my mentor. And she didn't let me forget it. And she really helped push me along to feel empowered to study something that I thought maybe I wasn't allowed to study. I don't know, because hardly anybody in psychology was studying that at that time.
Wow.
This is I entered my doctorate in 1994. So I got lucky. So along the way, when I started doing that research with her, I really dove deep. And she also encouraged me to do my dissertation on this topic because I was afraid to do that too. Yeah. I didn't know how I was going to find people to do it because, again, the internet problem. How was I going to find them? And the internet had just kind of come out as a way to sort of find people.
Then, yeah.
So, I mean, it's such a different world now. But she really encouraged me, and it sort of snowballed from there. It wasn't a plan.
But it turned out to be a really wonderful spot for you to be. You definitely have a reputation professionally in terms of your expertise in this field. And I've certainly come across your name and was thrilled to see you in the movie. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Yes. The contribution you made to that and some of the important things you said there. But I can certainly appreciate also what it must have been like not to have a real way to connect to adoptees before the internet. And I didn't find any adoptees until last year when I came out of the fog.
Wow.
So I'm still very new at this. A number of the people on the call are my friends, and it's always fun to see people here, but some of you were with me in this process. And I don't know what I would have done to discover adoptees before that. I guess I didn't believe they really existed. No, I had grown up with some as well and had no discussions with them, the ones I did grow up with, which was interesting. Some of them were my best friends and we never talked about it other than that it was like a club that, oh, you belong to this club too. And then we never talked about it.
That great club, yes. The
yes.
one that no one ever signed up for, but somehow was part of.
Right. And it stopped at the secret handshake, and there was no other engagement at that point in terms of specific things around what it's like to be adopted. But the area you've gone into, or some of your focus here on specifically on transnational or international and transracial adoption, there's a lot of complexity around there. I wonder if you could tell us something about that.
Absolutely. So that original, my mentor, Dr. Robbie Stewart, I'll tell you her name, she was amazing. And she really helped me in so many ways. So what we started doing was thinking about this whole question I had, like the racial identity theories assumed that your parents could impart race and cultural information to you. But we know for transracial adoptees, that's not the case. Yeah. So how are we supposed to do it? And because if we follow those models, transracial adoptees are automatically pathologized because there's no way we're going to be well developed in that in our identities because we don't have access to it. So I wanted to figure out a way to talk about where we were and what we were without pathologizing us. And my mentor at the time was a Black woman with a Black family living in a very white college town where her daughter had all her friends were white. And she was worried about her experience similarly of being what she thought of as displaced, not in a Black community. How is she going to identify? Who were going to be what's going to be her reference group? So we wrote that became my dissertation topic. I tested it out. And then I moved to New York to do my final psych internship. And once I moved here, I found myself in the hotbed of transracial adoption, which was great. Except for Minnesota, I was in the hotbed of transracial adoption, which allowed me so much more access. And that's a lot of where I started looking at these things. So from that original model, years later, I worked in culture camps then through people I met in the city, and worked at like a Korean culture camp for 4 summers, trying to understand what was going on there. Like, there were no culture camps when I was a kid. I couldn't even imagine showing up one day in the summer and finding 100 other kids who were adopted. Would have been unheard of, right? So I worked there trying to understand what their experience was. They're at this place where they have all these opportunities to learn about Korean culture and meet with Korean adults, some of whom were adopted, some of whom were real Koreans. So I looked at it originally as a cultural immersion experience, and collected data when I was there. And then I realized that's not what it was. When I was trying to figure out what the data was showing me, I was realizing that culture camp was really an adoptee socialization experience. And how is it that transracial adoptees, get to understand and learn about their birth culture? Because everyone talks about their culture, right? The adoptees, you should know your culture. Well, it's their birth culture, but their lived culture is almost always white American middle class culture, right? So how do you get access to something that's a minority culture in the US? If it was a dominant culture, we'd call that acculturation. But we don't have a term to describe it if you're seeking out something that doesn't exist very easily, that you have to really purposefully go out and try and find other people who are Chinese, for example, and get some access to the culture and learn it and try and reclaim it. So we came out with a paper that we made up a word, reculturation, to describe the process of trying to reclaim that birth culture and how people go about it and what the outcomes might be. So that's one of the things that I've worked on recently. I just am working with another adult transracial adoptee who is also an adoption scholar. We came up with we're working on validating a measure that we made to measure reculturation. And then I've also in the past, say, I guess about almost 10 years now, been working on a concept of adoption microaggressions. So if all of you guys have heard of microaggressions, it's really those common everyday slights, insults, and validations that people make often around race, like, oh, you speak English so well, which is something that I've heard many times in my life. And so it sounds like it's a compliment, but it's very insulting in lots of ways too, and very othering, right? So I think the same exact thing happens in adoption. When they ask, do you know your real parents? Or, oh, you're so lucky you were adopted. Your parents did such a wonderful thing, and I could go on and on. We have a lot of them.
Yes.
We've developed. So been studying that, just finishing up a paper on birth parents and microaggressions, adoption microaggressions, something we don't really, birth parents are so understudied and so misunderstood. So to hear the stories and the messages they get from people is particularly informative for us, my research team and me. So we've really enjoyed kind of diving into that.
That's actually the thing that I think attracted a lot of people in listening to your comments on reckoning with the primal wound was the microfictions, right? Is that what you called it?
Yes.
That was one of the questions I was going to have for you, and you've addressed that now here. Do you know your real parents? Or more specifically, things like you speak English well, that must be all the things that it would, and it does produce in adoptees. Does it also lead to them having a false narrative about themselves in any way? Are they asked to take on elements of a story that are not really true for them?
I think it's implicit. It's not so explicit. So I think transracial adoptees in general, they get a lot of strange experiences around race. So as kids, I call it honorary white status. When they're under the protection of their white parents, they can be, okay, they're maybe not going to steal something when they walk in here. But when I walked in without my mom, yes, I was under suspicion, right? So you get the honorary white status when you're a kid, but once you start looking like an adult or a teen, that goes away. And then people are starting to interact with you as though you're a real member of this ethnic group that feels that you're expected to know things that you don't know. And so you're neither. Then this is like fits in this cultural limbo microaggression. Like you're not white enough, and you're not Asian enough, you're not Black enough, or whatever it is, that you're not enough of that. And so you don't really fit in either space fully. I see some nods, and I know a lot of you have felt this. So that they do get that, I think.
Yeah.
Mhm.
This question is about adoptive parents, and it's related to this. Do you feel in general that people who adopt transracially or internationally are not really well equipped for what this will be like?
You're
And
asking a big question.
yeah, go ahead.
I want to not forget to go back to microfictions.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you.
So with adoptive parents, I think this is such a controversial thing, right? Because they all, by just the way, I don't know how much you guys know about or have seen some of the research from the 70s, 80s, and 90s that informed the multi-ethnic placement act. Sorry, I'm getting a call here. I just gotta. And so one of the things that they found is, right, that they can't say psychological adjustment necessarily differs in kids who were transracially adopted, but we know things like self-esteem and racial identity do. So I think that some parents, like, we don't want kids languishing in foster care. We don't want kids in institutions forever. Certainly not.
Sure.
Are there parents who can effectively raise a child who's different racially from them? I think it's possible, but I think it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of intentionality, and it takes an incredible willingness to go outside their comfort zone, to go into a place where they are not in the majority. And I think the majority of adoptive parents aren't necessarily willing or even aware that that's needed. And that's, I think, one of the challenges is, like, there's some people out there who are really making a concerted effort and realizing that they need to be uncomfortable too. And they need help, and they're reaching out for resources, and they're doing what they can to understand their privilege. And there's plenty who think God just saved them and that's it. They're meant to be these kids' parents. And that is not helping those kids. So I think we need to have very strict expectations for families. And whenever people ask me, oh, I want to adopt, I always send them to things that I know will scare them, because I want them to be scared. And then if they're scared enough, and they still want to do it, okay, good. Then they know what they're getting into. But if it's someone who's going to say it's all flowers and rainbows, then they're not getting the real deal. And I'm not saying adoptees are screwed up. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying the experience of being raised, not only as an adoptee, but being raised in a family that's racially different, it means you're going to be assaulted on all sides. Yeah. And you have to be willing to help your children handle that. To go back to microfictions.
Yes.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was trying to understand was all of the secrecy and all the lies that I know happen in adoption, not just transracial, all. I was always fascinated by how many kids who were adopted same race who were told their parents died in car crashes, right? That was such a common story. And then for transracial adoptees, international adoptees, we found out that many of our social history reports were completely falsified. Mine was completely falsified. What they said was my background was absolutely not true. There were parts of it that were true, but there was definitely big parts that were making me more adoptable. And so that I think really triggered by thinking, well, do people think that they're protecting kids when they tell these stories? Are they making us more adoptable by telling these, creating these fictions for us? Is that an insult or not? And I think it is. It's also, we know that things like late discovery adoptees exist. And I did a study with 2 adult LDAs, late discovery adoptees, who asked, so we got to have some data on this, to try and understand, like, can we just prove that lying to your kids for years is probably not helpful to them? So luckily the data came out in our favor, but these fictions that I think become part of the narrative of adoption are, I think, pretty destructive.
Did you see in your research that anything had shifted across the decades? Or are we pretty much where?
Well, yeah, I do think there is. I mean, not necessarily my research, but just in looking at like all of the people who are asking questions,
okay,
who are on adoptee Instagram and challenging people and saying, hey, this isn't cool. They're finally getting a voice. And to me, like, the fact that there's all of these newer, younger adoptee scholars out there who are starting to really raise some of these questions and put a critical lens to it is just so exciting to me. I'm no longer doing this alone. I feel like now I get to collaborate with a lot of people, and it's really fun for me. So yeah, I love that part, because I was scared of how people were going to hear what I was trying to say. And I wasn't trying to put on a hat of like, I'm a social justice warrior when doing it. I just felt like no therapist understood this. No, we're so pathologized. We have to do something.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So
that's my predictions.
That's really insightful to me. And since I came on the platform so recently, all these things were in place and I didn't get to see what it was like before that. But I know all of you people that have been doing this for decades must have seen some significant shifts like that. So I was really interested in your professional perspective on that. So thank you for that.
Well, I mean, along with that, Greg, is all of the movies that have been made, all the documentaries that filmmakers have done, because people are more willing to watch a movie than they are to read an article, right? So, and because movies already, so many of them have adoption and orphan themes in them just because it's a great plot line, right?
Yeah.
That we needed to start representing this more authentically. So I think it's gotten people to start listening more. And because we're in this time in life where people think we're post-racial when we are far from it, there has to be a critique of the elimination of many standards for what pre-adoptive parents need to know to adopt successfully.
It's actually leading into the next question I had, which was regardless of anyone's stance on adoption or abolition of adoption, it's going to continue. People will be adopted. And it seems like the best we can do is to help them be really as best prepared for that as possible. And I think you've suggested many ways for that to be the case. Would you recommend the same thing for people who are adopting domestically as for transracially in general?
100%. 100%. They need to really understand it. I mean, by and large, most folks who have not thought much about adoption, first of all, they don't know where they got their notions about adoption. even though I think it comes through media and so and movies and such. Second of all, they by and large think it's a good thing to do, and it's rescuing kids. And so if you come from that perspective and have only ever looked at it in that way, then you've never problematized it, and therefore you've never thought of the solutions and the challenges that come with it.
Yeah.
And so if parents aren't pushed to recognize, you know, telling kids to be grateful that they were rescued is not helpful, then we're just going to keep repeating it.
Absolutely. And we do, and we see that on across all these platforms, the same thing.
Absolutely.
And you can't, sometimes it's combative, sometimes it's just a statement of, I just didn't know that, and people are willing to learn about it. But
Yes.
sometimes they just want to challenge it and say, I'm here to disagree with you, and you're wrong, and I don't know why you can't see it. And that must be interesting to confront that in a clinical setting, let's say. And I won't, don't worry, I won't ask anything about your professional experience on that. I'm just thinking that you have an experience that's pretty unique here in terms of the comprehensiveness of it when it started, when nobody was talking about these things, and to have seen it unfold the way you have. And it's encouraging to hear that you're seeing signs of the more of the truths about adoption coming from adoptees, and a voice that they're now expressing that wasn't there before, or they didn't have a chance to before. And hopefully it's becoming, it still feels kind of on the fringe, but hopefully it's becoming more mainstream, and people are starting to sit and listen. And this leads directly into reckoning with the primal wound, because you've mentioned documentaries and films. And this, of course, is the big film right now for adoptees. And you were significantly involved in that. How did you come to work on that? And what was that like for you?
Autumn is persistent. And so
Yes, she is.
that's pretty much how I came. She contacted me out of the blue. And so I was, we started, it was hard because it was during the kind of the height of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So we were trying to film this in a way that was COVID safe and from distance. And I basically had to do my parts like 3 or 4 times because of technology problems. But then she also just let me talk. So I would just do much like what I'm doing here. And I would, make my critiques and such. So I didn't know what was going to end up being in the film. Yeah. Interesting.
But it did lead to a continuing friendship between you.
And yes, absolutely.
She helped me get in touch with you today to make sure that I had connected with you. So she's been wonderful. We were pleased to interview her as well and have her as a member of Fireside Adoptees. And people are excited about this film. And it's a thrilling experience to be included in the credits of the film. A lot of us are in the adoptee army. And that was an exhilarating thing for me to see my name on there for the first time. And I've seen the film twice, and I'll be seeing it again. And what is it like for you to watch that film? For me? Yes. Well, I've seen a lot of versions of it. So that's, okay. So I sometimes can't remember which version is the one that's actually everyone else is seeing. Oh, I see. So I'm thinking of the one since around February timeframe. Maybe. Yeah. So the one that I keep thinking of is a different version, but it's not. So, but I know what's out there now. It's good to see. I've been lucky enough to get to comment in other films, and I was worried that because most of the people she was interviewing were same-race domestic adoptees, many of whom were adopted pre-Roe v. Wade, that maybe what I had to say wasn't going to be that relevant to the experience. And I was excited to hear that people were finding it helpful and useful, because that meant a lot to me, that even though I have a sort of particular so a lot of the stuff I have to talk about is race related too, that it was still something that was useful. I think one of the last things I'd like to ask you is, you've done a lot of important work with agencies at a governmental level on transracial and international adoption. And Could you talk a little bit about the things you've done there?
I think you're way too kind with that, Greg. I would say
Yeah.
not very important because I don't know that I've changed anything, but I'm not sure specifically what you're talking about. I've done trainings and
I'm talking about, I think you've interacted with, in an advocacy sense, I think, for people who are international and transracial adoptees. And maybe you've
yes.
been able to do that at a level higher than most adoptees in that category have been able to do it. That's really what I'm talking
Oh,
about.
I see. Yeah, that's true. That's probably true. I was a senior fellow for the Donaldson Adoption Institute when it still existed. And I've been involved in some others like the Rudd Adoption Research Program, things like that. So yeah, I mean, I think the thing is I get a chance to have a little bit of a platform, which is nice. And I don't know how ridiculous this sounds or not, but I feel like I'm trying to voice what I hear from the people I know. I've worked with lots and lots of adoptees over the years now as a therapist, and I have lots of friends who are adoptees, and I feel like those voices need to be heard. And sometimes people will listen to someone who's done research, who's a clinician, maybe a little better. If they think I'm not under the category of an angry adoptee, then maybe they'll hear me better. So I think I try and use those things that have given me some credibility over the years to try and put that voice out there and speak for the folks that I know. Because like all the things that I do, those have not all been my experience, of course. Like I was not a late discovery adoptee or any of those things, but I do think that these are all really valid experiences and something that people need to understand and recognize exist. Because people think of adoptees as a privileged group who were rescued, and so we shouldn't be pissed off. And so I think that puts us all in a position to have it harder for people to take our complaints and our critiques seriously.
That's so astute. Yeah, that's a brilliant summary of that. And it does give you an advantage in the professional sense of, unfortunately, that people can't hear our voices as well, maybe as they can hear yours because of your training and credentials. And you are saying the same sort of things we are, but maybe they're
Exactly,
listening more to you than they are to us.
Exactly. Right. Like, some of my friends who are in the abolitionist world. Now, I'm not, because I don't think it's a realistic expectation. I don't no shade on anybody who is in that camp. It's really more just, I think we need to figure out how to make this work for those who are still going to be adopted anyway. We need to help those folks who've already been adopted. And there's no going back on that. So yeah, I've also been lucky enough to be involved in this conference, the Adoption Initiative Conference. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of it. It's based in New York. We just had our first virtual conference, and I've been involved with it since 2000. And so gradually I started running it and started trying to put more adoptee voices centered as keynotes and as the committee, so that we have adoptee activists on the board. We are asking questions that people don't really like so much. There's a lot of times people are saying, that conference, they're too radical or something. So I feel like we're doing our job. It's just the problem is the people who need to hear it aren't hearing it. So that's where our challenge is.
Well, we're so appreciative of your time, Amanda. Thank you so much. What I'll do is I'm going to announce the end of the interview in terms of the recording piece. And I hope that everyone will tune into the Fireside YouTube channel if you'd like to watch and leave your comments. We certainly appreciate everyone's interest in what's going on here. Thank you so much for meeting with us today, and best of luck with your continued work. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.